Chapter 3 Brilland Sharn. Dane had heard stories of Sharn, but mere words could not convey the overwhelming presence of the city. The wide street was filled with a churning mob. Half a dozen different languages filled the air. A Talenten merchant was haggling with a young gnome over the price of Halodan mealworms. A pale elf, wearing a golden gown and a thin mask of beaten silver, was walking down the street, accompanied by a massive ogre laborer who was carrying a trunk formed from bronzed bones. A patrol of black-cloaked guardians watched the streets with suspicious eyes and the promise of swift retribution. The most disorienting part was the sky, or the lack thereof. This district was entirely enclosed in one of the massive towers of Tavik's Landing, and above their heads the hollow core of the tower stretched up out of sight. Gargoyles and hippogriffs whirled in the air above them, darting between the different levels of the tower. The walls of the central tower were easily 50 feet thick, and buildings and businesses were carved directly into the walls. The interior of the tower must have been 600 or 700 feet across, filled with smaller spires and buildings. "Nice place," Jode said, taking it all in stride. "At least you don't have to worry about the rain. I'd watch out for falling hippogriff dung, though. That's insult and injury for you." "There's still rain," Lay said absently, studying the street ahead. "I'm not a specialist in weather, but apparently enough condensation builds up in the heights of the tower to rain on the people at the bottom." "Isn't that always the way? So, where are we going, my lady?" "A place called Dalan's Refuge. It's on the upper levels of this quarter. That robber had a few sovereigns in his purse. Unless you feel like climbing a lot of stairs, I was hoping to find a coach." "After all you've been through, my lady, I would say that you deserve a little luxury at the end." Dane scowled. "You disagree, Captain?" Jode inquired. "You never know what's going to happen," Dane said. "We only have a few coins to our name. I hate to waste even one." "You worry too much, my captain. Once we arrive at Lord Hadran's estate, Lady Lay has promised to see us well compensated from his lordship's treasury." "I know Hadran will look after you," Lay said. "He's a good man. And... oh, there's one." She waved, and a vessel dropped from the air to meet them. At a glance, the sky coach was a long, narrow rowboat built from fire pine and darkwood. A figurehead of a swan was embedded at the prow of the ship. The image of its outstretched wings was engraved along the length of the boat, glittering in the cold light of the mystical torches. The driver was a young woman dressed in a simple white gown, bearing the emblem of a swan on the left breast. Her short, silvery hair and wide eyes hinted at a touch of elven blood. "How may I help you?" the driver inquired. "There's 4 of us," Lay replied, stepping into the floating boat. "To Roundwind in Dalan's Refuge." Money exchanged hands. The rest of them climbed in. Dane taking the seat next to Lay. Jode and Pierce sat across from them. The boat rose into the air. The sky coach rose along the central core, then entered a tunnel. Within moments, they emerged into open air, skimming past the bridges and smaller spires of Tavik's Landing as they ascended toward the heavens. It gave Dane an eagle's eye view of the city. There were towers upon towers, buildings that dwarfed the tallest tree he'd ever seen, and bridges ran between many of them, spanning chasms that would mean certain death to anyone foolish enough to climb the guardrails. Round wind? Dane asked, turning to Lay. People give their mansions names. You know, like friendly arms or welcoming light. I'm familiar with the tradition, but round wind? What does it mean? Oh, don't argue over trivialities. This is it, Dane. It's over. All those years of war, all the blood, the death, it all ends here. I'm going home. Dane's mouth tightened. This isn't your home. Lay dropped her eyes and looked away for a moment. Look, I'm angry too. My parents, my closest friends, I lost them too. I know this isn't sincere, but our old life is gone, Dane, and it isn't coming back. You've seen what's left of our homeland. It's time to move on, to start again. Dane said nothing. Pierce and Jode stared out at the spectacle of the city stretched before them, staying well out of the conversation. Have you thought about my offer? I'm sure there's a place for you in the household. As what? Dane snapped. A guard, patrolling round wind, and making sure no hippogriffs crap on his lordship's roof? Dane slammed his fist on the railing. Would it be so different? Don't, Lay, Dane warned. I fought for Seer. You may think you know me, but you have no idea what I've sacrificed, or why I served the Queen. I'm no sword for hire, and the last thing I'm going to do is work for a dragon-marked house. Lay looked away. When her temper was hot, she was more than a match for Dane. But clearly, her heart wasn't in this battle. Why? What do you know of the houses? Is Lord Dane too good to work for a craftsman's daughter? How can you, of all people, ask me that? Have you forgotten what happened at Whitehearth? Do you expect me to forget? She looked back at him, and he saw the glitter of a tear in her eye before she turned away again. Have you? Her words were cold water on Dane's fiery temper. Lay, look. Lay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. He paused, trying to find the right words. There's a lot about me you don't know. You and Jode are the only marks I've ever had as friends. And I'm no sellsword, all right? I've got to find another path. I don't know what it is yet. He held out his hand, and after a long moment, she took it. I'm sorry, she said. Can you at least stay the night at Round Wind? A hot meal, a nice bed, and in the morning, I'm sure Hadran will be willing to give you a good breakfast and enough gold to get you started on whatever path you choose. He took a deep breath, then nodded, and looked away. Yes, thanks. Though I think I might prefer a last bowl of your gruel. I think I'm gonna miss it. Not me, Jode broke in. Offense, my lady. But I'd just as soon never see that you again. Lay smiled faintly. I'm looking forward to real food myself. How about you? Will you be finding a place in one of the houses of healing? Dane had wondered this himself. If the war was truly over, it was the obvious role for a man with Jode's talents. But healing was the domain of House Jurasco. Jode's dragon mark hinted at a tie to the house, yet he'd never spoken of it. I'm not ready to settle down yet. Pierce and I thought we'd stay with the captain and see where the fortune took us. Right, Pierce? You won't be coming with me, Pierce, Lay said, surprised. The Warforged soldier glanced over at them. I'm sorry, Lay. His voice was deep and resonant, slow, water running across stone. I would not have survived the war without your aid, but I wish to remain with Captain Dane. The war may be over, but he is still my commander. House Cannith sold me to Seer. The house does not own me now. This time, tears finally began to flow. I knew we'd be going our separate ways, but Pierce, Lay looked up at the armored warrior. I just thought that you'd... While she was casting about for words, the boat dropped sharply, stealing her breath. Round wind, shouted the driver. Lay dried her eyes and nodded. We'll discuss this later tonight, she said, her voice tight. I'm going to have a lot to explain to Hadran. As impressive as the lower streets of Sharn had been, Dallin's Refuge was on an entirely different level, literally and figuratively. The district was built on a massive ring encircling one of the largest towers of Tavik's Landing, and they were thousands of feet above the waters of the Dagger. Despite the altitude, the breezes were warm and light, and Dane had no trouble with the air. They were surrounded by the ostentatious display of wealth. Statues surrounded the streets, prominent citizens of Sharn captured for eternity in bronze and marble. At the edge of the ring, a fountain of illusions threw shimmering columns of rainbow light into the air, dropping off the edge to fall towards the lower districts. Night had fallen, and there were far fewer people on the streets than there had been below. Dallin's Refuge was a residential district, and most of its inhabitants had either retired for the evening or were off seeking entertainment in more exotic regions. Roundwind proved to be true to its name, at least partially. The manor was formed from large spheres of different stones, merged together to create an unusual aesthetic effect. Hadran's grandfather was an architect, Lay explained. And insane? Dane muttered. Two men in Cannith livery stood at the front gate, but they allowed the group to pass once Lay displayed her Cannith signet. They walked down a long corridor with rounded walls. Statues of Hadran's ancestors watched from either side, proud artificers and wizards bearing the symbols of the house. Eventually, the hall opened into a large atrium, but a bulky warforge that dwarfed even Pierce blocked the path. Where Pierce was designed for battle, this guardian seemed to have been built to impress. He was armored with plates of silver, and gemstones adorned his torso and faceplate. Lay seemed to recognize the forged and stepped out in front of Dane. Domo, I have returned, and I have 3 guests. I apologize for arriving unexpectedly. It's a very long story. Please inform your master at once. The Warforged did not budge. You are not expected, nor are you welcome in Roundwind. Leave now. His voice was a deep, rolling rumble, and the hostility was unmistakable. Lay frowned. What are you talking about, Domo? I am Lay de Cannith of Metro. She held her signet before her like a sword, and her anger caused the Cannith seal to blaze with light. You will announce me to Lord Hadran at once, or I'll see you melted into scrap. The air seemed to ripple around her hands, and Dane had a flashback of a warforged soldier exploding in the Battle of Keldan Ridge. I do not take orders from excoriates, said Domo. You have no place here. Return to the streets, or I shall summon gods and have you removed. The words hit Lay like a blow. The fire went out of her, and she took a step back. Dane half expected Joe to jump in, but even he looked pale. Lay looked back at the Warforged, seemingly dazed. But why? Domo raised a hand, and Dane heard guards approaching. He stepped forward and took Lay's arm. Back off, Gemstone. We're leaving. Lay followed blindly, still in a state of shock. As they walked down the long path, Lay paused to look at the statue closest to the door. It was a work in progress, a masculine figure in the robes of a Canith artificer, but the features were still unformed. Lay stared at the blank face in silence, and then allowed Dane to pull her toward the street. We spent all of our silver on the coach, Jode said, so I'm afraid you're going to have to take the long way down. I think we should go to that high walls district the gate guard mentioned. If there are other Sirens there, it's probably our best chance for finding shelter. Still, we're going to need coin, and quickly. Lay still seemed to be in a daze. She had taken off her Canith signet and was idly turning it around in her hand. Dane couldn't remember seeing her cry before today, but for the second time today, her eyes were glittering in the light of the cold flames. Pierce was bringing up the rear of the group, and he approached Lay. My lady, what is wrong? I am afraid I do not understand the conversation at the manor gate. Lay stopped walking. Anger and sorrow warred on her face. I am not your lady, Pierce. Not anymore. I'm excoriate, Jode said quickly. Lay wheeled to face him with fury in her eyes, then clenched her fists and turned away. She grabbed Pierce in a fierce embrace, sobbing against the mithril plating of his chest. Pierce had been forged for war, and none of his companions could match his skills in battle, but he knew little about soothing distress. He put his hands on Lay's shoulders, as if he was worried he might break her. My lady, I do not know this word. What is this excoriate? Lay continued sobbing. Why? She murmured. Excoriation is a tradition among the dragon-marked houses, Jode said, his tone more subdued than usual. It is a punishment reserved for those who have severely violated the precepts of the house. Not unlike excommunication in the Church of the Silver Flame, it was first put into practice around the time of the War of the Mark, though back then they would actually flay the skin from the victim, stripping away his mark, both literally and figuratively. You can't actually cut away a dragon mark, can you? Dane asked. No, you can't actually take the mark away. The flaying was a symbolic gesture, though many excoriates must have died during the process. The social implications are what matters. An excoriate is no longer part of the house. Other members of the house are not to speak of him or aid him in any way. He is barred from all enclaves and estates. He cannot marry within the house. If he claims to be an heir of the house, he can be prosecuted under the laws of Galifar. It's a serious charge, and it takes the authority of a baron or a house council to order it. Dane approached Lay and gently put his hand on her back. Lay, he said softly, why would they want to do this to you? What have you done? They pushed away from Pierce and Dane. I don't know, she howled. All I've ever done, I've done for the house. How could they do this to me? Blind with rage, she made a savage gesture with her left hand. There was a glitter of silver, and Dane realized that she'd hurled her signet off the great ring of Dallin's Refuge to fall thousands of feet to the peaks below. Jode sighed. That would have bought us at least a night's lodging, he shrugged. Look, Captain, we need to get moving if we're going to get a roof over our heads. He made a sidelong gesture with his head. And I think the natives are getting restless. Indeed, a few Brellish guardsmen were watching them from 100 feet away, and one was idly toying with his crossbow. You're right, he sighed. Lay. Look, we'll sort this out. Just give it time. Pierce, could you... He gestured at Lay, and the warforged soldier carefully picked her up. Take heart, my lady, he rumbled as they began the long journey down. This battle has just begun. Interlude. Raziel hated the deep tunnels of Kyber's Gate. The smell of sewage and smoke filled the air, and the cold torches were few and far between, leaving long pools of shadow in the subterranean passages. But business was business. He stood beneath the flickering torch, cleaning his fingernails with his dagger, and trying to look calm. Raziel. The voice from the shadows was soft and oily. A moment later, 3 people emerged from the darkness. As promised, they were unarmed. The man in the lead wore a tattered brown cloak, and his face was hidden by a deep cowl. A man and a woman stood behind him, dressed in rough-spun cloth patched up with burlap. They were covered with dirt and scabs, and their faces were almost devoid of expression. How did I ever come to this, Raziel thought. Yeah, Raziel Tarkinen. That's me. I thank you for meeting up so promptly. I trust you have the merchandise that we discussed. The voice of the hooded man seemed to shift slightly every time he spoke. It was barely noticeable, but the pitch and inflection changed from moment to moment. Yeah, I got it. Raziel tossed the small pouch in the air and caught it with his left hand, revealing the glistening black dragon mark and the sores upon his palm. The hooded man seemed hissed. Yes, good. The question is if you can uphold your end of our bargain, said Raziel. Gold is a start, but until you prove that you can deliver on your promises, this, he tossed the bag and caught it in his right hand, stays with me. And if you're thinking of trying anything stupid, he extended his left hand, and for a moment the shadows seemed to be drawn toward his palm. I'd stop now. The hooded man laughed, a horrible gurgling sound. For a moment his face was revealed by the torchlight, and Raziel gasped. It was a horrible ruin with exposed muscle that seemed to pulse and twitch with his laughter. Oh, have no fear, Raziel, the stranger said. All your problems will be over soon enough. His 2 companions leaped forward without a sound, moving with unnatural speed and in perfect unison. It was clear Raziel couldn't outrun them, so he hurled the pouch at the wall of the tunnel, hoping to smash its contents and steal their victory. But to his shock, a fleshy tentacle lashed out from the spokesman's arm and snatched the purse from the air. The next thing he knew, the man with the vacant stare was right in front of him, slashing at him with claws that had grown from his hands. What were these people? Raziel spun to the side, but even as he did, he felt a burning pain along his ribs. The stranger's claws tore into his side. But now, it was Raziel's turn. He slammed his left hand into the man's face, letting his power flow through his palm and into his attacker. As always, the pain was excruciating, but as bad as it was for him, it was far worse for his victim. The stranger cried out, the first sound he'd made, and fell to his knees, clutching at his face. Raziel smiled, but he had forgotten about the woman. The next thing he knew, there was a sharp pain in the back of his neck, and he found himself falling. Darkness stole his senses before he hit the ground. Chapter 4. Breland Sharn. They must have walked half a mile before they found the lift. Now, they were slowly dropping toward the bottom of Sharn on a large disk of floating metal. Dane tried to ignore the fact that the only thing standing between him and a drop of 2,000 feet was a thin, invisible field of arcane energy. Pierce was carrying Lay cradled in his arms. She had finally fallen asleep. Dane stood at the center of the disk, talking quietly to Jode. How do we even know this is real? What if that whetstone of a warforged was playing some sort of a joke? Jode shook his tiny head. It's not that something you joke about, Captain. Especially a warforged. Doubly, so a servant in the house of the Lord she's to be married to. That forged belonged to the household. If the Lord wanted to melt him down, he could. What about Hadran, then? Could he have put the forged up to it? Or condemned Lay to get out of the marriage? They haven't seen each other for years, right? No, it still doesn't make sense. Lay's family died with Seer. If Hadran wants out, who's going to challenge him? Besides, there are established grounds for excoriation. You know that as well as I do. It's not something you do on a whim, Lord or no Lord. Dane sighed. Meanwhile, we are high and dry. So much for Lord Hadran's fabled generosity. And if Sharn is anything like Metrol, I imagine the guards won't like us setting up camp on the street corner. Jode smiled. Leave it to me, Captain. Have I ever let you down? I'm going to pretend that you didn't just ask me that. Once a residential district, high walls had been converted to serve as a prison, a fortified ghetto for those deemed a security risk to Breland and Sharn. Now that the war was coming to a close, the gates were open and the portcullises were raised. But the guards remained, and black-cloaked archers walked the walls that gave the region its name. Beyond the gates, the district was a dismal sight. Walls were cracked, windows broken, cobblestones had even been lifted from the streets. The few people who were still about were filthy folk in torn and soiled clothes, watching from alleys or peering out of shattered windows. Well, it looks like there aren't any guards to keep us from sleeping in the street. But I wouldn't recommend it, Jode said. Seems to me like our friend Morgulin would be right at home here. What exactly are we looking for here? Asked Dane. I'll know it when I see it. A few moments later, Jode held up a hand, motioning him to stop. This'll do. A rather melancholy Manticore was painted on the sign above the door, and not with any particular skill. In one corner was the horn of the hostel, along with a small star of seer. Well, it looks like Sirens are welcome. But we still have one problem. The complete absence of coin, said Dane. Trust me. Jode threw open the door and strode inside as if he owned the place. Dane followed while Pierce set Lay's feet on the ground and gently shook her awake. The interior of the Manticore Inn was as uninspired as the facade. The sullen people sitting around the common room studied the travelers suspiciously. Here and there, Dane did see the telltale look of seer in some of the faces, a narrow chin, hazel eyes ringed with brown. But if Jode was banking on an outpouring of love, he was sorely mistaken. To Dane's surprise, Jode called out loudly in the tongue of the Talenta Plains, and a moment later, the innkeeper appeared. She was a stout halfling with streaks of gray in her brown hair, and she returned Jode's query in the same tongue. An animated discussion followed as Jode indicated each traveler in turn and went through a bizarre series of pantomimed actions. Even the other patrons took an interest, leaning forward to watch the antics of this seemingly mad halfling. The innkeeper seemed dubious, but eventually she nodded, and Jode embraced her. Pushing him away, she went back to the kitchen. I've got us a few days of credit, Jode whispered. Now whatever she says, just nod. A moment later, the innkeeper returned with a set of keys and led them upstairs. The keys seemed almost unnecessary, as most of the doors were on the verge of falling off of their hinges. She opened the door at the end of the hall. I know it's not what you're used to, General, she said, but hopefully it will suffice until your letters of credit are cleared by the bank. Dane glanced over at Jode. General? We've been in the field for many days, lady. Your generosity is appreciated. He knelt to kiss her hand, and she looked away and blushed. Oh, not at all, General. To think, one of the Queen's trusted advisors in my humble inn, and after you risked so much to save those Talentan orphans. Truly, a few days is the least I can do. She smiled again. Breakfast is served at the 8th bell. I look forward to hearing more tales of your valor and battle. Of course, Jode said. But at the moment, the General needs his rest. Once upon a time, the room might have had a cold fire lamp. It might have included a bed, but furniture had been stripped away, leaving only a pair of mildewed pallets set against the floor. There was a single oil lamp, and spiders scattered into the shadows when Jode managed to get it lit. Dane had seen prison cells with more ambience. He sighed. All right, Jode. General? Jode shrugged. Dassie likes war stories. I trust you can spin a few. She seemed especially interested in your efforts to help halfling children escape Seer, especially in the last days of the war, despite great personal risk and constant attack by the undead warriors of Karnath. Dane shook his head, smiling. And what did this buy us? Well, she likes stories, but she still drives a hard bargain. She's extending credit for 5 days, at which point she expects to be paid in full, and then some. Luckily for us, prices are quite reasonable. Hardly surprising, considering the luxurious accommodations. This coming from a man who woke up in a muddy ditch? Fair enough. Any thoughts on how we're going to pay her? A few. I'll get the lay of the land in the morning, Captain. For now, I think that rest is called for. Dane nodded. Yes, I suppose you're right. You and Lay take the beds. Compared to my nice stitch, the floor will be nice. Pierce helped Lay to the pallet, then got their blankets out of her pack. Within moments, Lay and Jode were fast asleep. Pierce drew his long flail and turned to face the door, preparing for the night's watch. Dane turned down the lamp. He lay in the darkness for what seemed like an eternity. Occasionally, there was a shout or a cry from the street, or movement outside the door. At such times, Dane found his hand was resting on the hilt of his sword before he'd even thought about it. But eventually, he found his way to sleep. Interlude. The first thing Raziel noticed was the smell. His nostrils were filled with it, a cloying blend of cinnamon, sulfur, and burned flesh. The second sensation was sound, bubbling, dripping, a vast assortment of liquid noise. Sight returned before touch. He was lying on a curved table, staring up at an arched ceiling hewn into solid stone. The table was slightly tilted, his feet higher than his head, and his head throbbed with a rush of blood. After a moment, he realized that he was spread-eagled on the surface, his numbed limbs attached to the table with steel manacles. He could only move his head a little, but he couldn't see that he was surrounded by large glass tanks, each filled with a different shade of luminous fluid. The only light in the chamber came from this rippling liquid. Vague shapes were moving in some of these tanks, casting shadows across the ceiling, writhing tentacles, pulsating amoeba. Was that a hand? His own limbs were completely numb. Tentatively, he tried channeling the shadows through his dragon mark. Nothing. No flow of power. No pain. Was it just the side effect of the venom or spell that held him paralyzed? Or was there something else at work? I thank you, Raziel Tarkanen. You have proved doubly useful to our cause. Raziel stiffened at the sound of the oily voice. With an immense effort, he lifted his head to look for the source of the sound. The hooded man stood at the foot of the table, but he wasn't hooded any longer. His visage was even more horrific than the momentary glimpse had implied. Hands, neck, face, all a horror. In place of skin, the man had pulsing bloody muscle. The cords and sinews seemed unnaturally thick, and they moved of their own accord, twitching in ways that normal muscular contraction couldn't account for. He was larger than Raziel had realized, layers of wet muscle bulging beneath simple brown robes. His eyes were sunk deep within his sockets, and they glittered with madness. His mouth was a bloody ruin, and bony talons tipped his spidery fingers. "What are you?" Raziel whispered. Simply moving his jaw was almost impossible, and forcing the words through his throat took every ounce of willpower he possessed. "What I am is irrelevant. The question is what I will become. Thanks to you, I am one step closer to the answer." His mouth. There was something wrong with his mouth, but Raziel couldn't quite make sense of it. "What become?" "Don't struggle, Raziel. You have served us well. My master comes, and he shall grant you the rest you deserve." Rest. Was this monster going to kill him? After everything he'd done, all he'd been through, was this how he was going to die? "You will not die. Embrace eternity in me." It took a moment for Raziel to realize that the thought was not his own. Chapter 5. Brilland Sharn. The 9th bell was ringing when Dane opened his eyes. He was alone. His hand dropped to his sword and found nothing. The door to the room began to open. He rolled to the side and rose up behind the door. A large armored figure crept into the room, moving with eerie silence. Dane clenched his fists together and prepared to deliver a mighty blow to the back of the intruder's skull, and then checked himself. It was Pierce. Pierce! Where are the others? Where's my sword? Pierce turned to face him, seemingly unsurprised. Jode went out earlier this morning. I believe he took your sword with him. Lady Lay is in the common room, finishing breakfast. Mistress Darcy is about to close her kitchen, and Lay thought you might want food. I'm supposed to tell you that she won't be conjuring food for anyone too lazy to get out of bed at a reasonable hour. Dane scowled and reached for his chainmail shirt. I don't believe you need arms, Captain. I was studying the other patrons. There were a few knives, but I don't believe there is any imminent danger. Dane shrugged. Well then, let's go. Lay was sitting at a round table, talking with the innkeeper. Her eyes were slightly puffy, and she seemed more pale than usual. Her voice was cool and level. You're in luck, Dane. Darcy saved the last bowl of gruel for you. By now, I imagine it's cold, just the way you like it. The halfling scuttled off to fetch Dane's meal. Lay's conjured food had no taste whatsoever. After trying the innkeeper's cold, pasty porridge, Dane found that he missed it. How are you? He asked. Lay glared at him. Fine. Wonderful. Oh, I couldn't be better, General. Her voice was sharp, but Dane let it go. At this point, anger might be the only way to hold back tears. No sign of Jode? No. The wretched weasel took my pack. If he does anything with my warforged, I'll skin him alive. Lay. He tried to touch her hand, but she jerked away. We'll get through this. She glared at him. Don't you dare tell me how I should feel, Dane. You have no idea. This is my family. This is my life. To be treated like this, to think that Hadran would allow this? Is there anyone you can talk to? This isn't your first time in Sharn. Is there anyone who might give us information? Lay started to snap, then took a deep breath and began again. Yes, it's possible. They'd never see me at the Enclave, but there are a few people I might look to. But you have to understand, my family was from Metro. I don't know many of the Brelish Canyith, and if Hadran won't see me, I don't know. She shook her head. I don't understand. Try to be patient. We'll get to the bottom of this. The door flew open, and Jode came in from the street. He was smiling and flushed and half dragging Lay's pack. Drinks all around, he called, tossing Darcy a gold galifar. First round's on me. At 10th bell, Dane remarked, but none of the other patrons were turning down a free round, and it had been some time since Dane had had anything other than water. Unfortunately, the Manticore's ale was of the same fine quality as its porridge. Jode climbed up on the table and slid the pack across to Lay. She watched him with narrowed eyes. He smiled disarmingly and took a long pull of ale, followed by a terrible face. How is it we're suddenly buying for the house? Dane asked. Lay was already looking through the pack. Well, I thought it would be good if I got the lay of the land, got to know my way around town. And while I was at it, I found a pawner who seemed like a decent woman. And I thought it would be good if we had a few coins to rub together. Where's my crossbow? Lay said. Oh, come now. We're in the greatest city in the world. You really think you need a crossbow on the streets of Sharn? Dane put a gentle hand on the halfling's shoulder. Pierce said that you took my grandfather's sword with you when you left this morning. May I have it back now? I'm sure it will be safe, Dane. He tightened his grip. You know, I've got a good sense of people. Besides which, you've still got your dagger, right? Jode, I know this may seem unwise, but I assure you, I've already put the coin to good use. By buying watered-down ale for a group of strangers? I tracked down an old friend of yours. Someone I'm sure can help us find our feet. I'm listening. He hadn't released his grip. Alina Lyris. Dane swore and knocked his tankard to the floor. He pulled Jode across the table. Is this a joke? No. She's been in Sharn for over a year. I thought that with your history, you know, perhaps she could offer us some work. Lay was lost in her thoughts again, but Pierce took an interest. What history is this? Who is this Alina? Dane took a deep breath and let go of Jode. He forced a smile and sat down. Alina Loridan Lyris. She's an old friend I had dealings with before I joined the Queen's Guard. How might she help us? Jode answered, Alina's a wealthy woman, and I'm sure she has a lot of connections in Sharn. I'm certain that she'd be happy to help an old friend like Dane. I've already talked to one of her associates and set up a meeting in 1 hour. Dane bit his lip, but stayed silent. Then let us ready ourselves, said Lay. Dane shook his head. I don't know. If we should concentrate on all of our resources in one place? Brilliant as always, General. Pierce, why don't you and Lay see what you can find about House Kenneth? There must be someone in Sharn who's willing to talk to you, Lay. Dane and I can speak with Alina. Pierce glanced over at Lay, and after a moment, she nodded. Very well, Jode said brightly. We'll meet back here at, say, 2 bells? I'm going to get my armor, Dane said, scowling. Alina Lyris? What have you gotten us into? High Walls was just as dismal by the light of day as it was in the dark. The ghetto was an exterior district built along the outer wall of the great tower of Tavik's Landing. The alleys and streets were filled with refugees of all nations, but the majority of the beggars and miserable laborers were Sirens. With the destruction of their homeland, these unfortunate souls had nowhere else to go. They passed a one-armed veteran of the Queen's Guard who stretched out his good hand in an imploring gesture. In a nearby alley, a pair of feral children were chasing a dog, stones in their hands. You know, she's our best hope. You know she'll have the money, said Jode. And what will we have to do to get it? Give her a chance. We don't have to agree to anything. I'm going to see Alina Lyris. And do you know what the best part of it is? You pawned my thrice-forsaken sword. All the more reason to see Alina, yes? The sooner we get some money, the sooner you can get it back. A new voice intruded.
Pardon me, General.
The voice belonged to an old man who had come up behind the pair. Like all of the inhabitants of High Walls, it was clear he had seen better days. A horrible scar could be seen at the base of his neck, puckered flesh disappearing beneath his robe. But despite the dirt on his skin and his torn clothing, the stranger carried himself with a sense of dignity and pride, and his voice had an air of quiet authority. He studied Dane with an appraising eye.
I thought I knew most of our generals, yet...
A simple mistake, Jode said brightly. I know that there have been a lot of wild stories about the region, but my companion is Captain Dane of the Queen's Guard. He served with valor and distinction until the very end, and I'm sure you've simply heard how he saved the life of General Dallas in the Battle of the Three Moons. The old man brought an end to the tale with a raised hand.
Captain, then. I am...
Terrell Irsaurus, Dane said. The man nodded. I remember seeing you at court in Metrol when I was younger.
You have a good memory, Captain. It has been many years since I advised the Queen. And now... it is too late to save her. Sovereigns, guard her soul and save us all.
Dane inclined his head respectfully, then returned to his careful study of the old noble. Lucky you were away from Metrol on the big day. How'd you end up here?
A long story, and not one for the streets. Perhaps you'll join me for dinner this evening. There are many of us in Sharn, and I'm trying to bring the refugees together.
Of course, Dane said. I'm sure it can't be worse than what they'll be serving at the Manticore.
Wonderful,
Terrell said with a slight bow.
It's the black tent in the central square. I'll see you at sunset.
Dane inclined his head respectfully, while Jode made a dramatic bow. The elderly man smiled slightly before turning away and disappearing into the crowd. Dane watched him go. What do you make of that? Jode shrugged and continued walking. He's a generous man trying to create a bastion of Syrian values. Or he's an opportunistic hoping to capitalize on the anger of the refugees to form a power block. I know which seems more likely to me. But does it matter? I suppose not. They walked a ways in silence, eventually passing through the gates of High Walls and into the tower of Tavik's Landing. So, where are we meeting Alina? It's called Denias. It's in one of the other towers. It's going to be a long walk, I'm afraid. Unless you'd like to take one of the sky coaches. After that worked out so well yesterday. I don't think so. I'm not about to let you throw away any more of the money you made from my family sword. Speaking of family, said Jode, have you told Lay? No, I'm not going to. And neither are you. Is that understood? Whatever you say. But if there was ever a time... No. And that's final. Dane stopped and knelt down, grabbing Jode and spinning him around. Do you understand? No hints, no jokes, leave it alone. All right? But I still think... Jode! All right, my lips are sealed. Don't give me any ideas. They walked on in silence for a few moments, until Jode tugged on Dane's leg. Over there. A line of people were shuffling onto a raised circular platform. It seemed to be some sort of stage about 25 feet across and enclosed by a low metal rail. The wide ramp seemed to have been designed for wagons. What about it? Said Dane. That's where we're going, Jode said. leading Dane onto the stage. "We're meeting Alina here?" Jode rolled his eyes. "No! This is how we get up to Denias. Captain can't afford a sky coach." At that moment, the platform began to rise. The district of Denias was located amidst the upper spires of the Mentis towers, high in the sky. Dane was beginning to adapt to the noise and bustle of the lower streets, but Denias was something else again. The lower levels fit Dane's vision of a large city, grime and poverty everywhere, with merchants hawking their wares and beggars assailing any who would listen. By contrast, Denias was an image from a storybook tale. The streets were clean, the buildings bright and cheerful, the air filled with song and laughter. On a street corner, a troubadour was teaching a group of children to weave light from air, tracing hypnotic patterns of shimmering color with his fingers. As Dane watched, one of the onlookers produced a shaky but similar trail. They were gnomes. Denias was the heart of Sharn's gnome population, and Dane towered over the vast majority of the people on the street, just over 3 feet in height, taller and stockier than halflings. The gnomes reminded Dane less of human children and more of miniature adults. They wore fine clothes in a rainbow of colors, and everyone was impeccably groomed. Most of the men had well-trimmed beards and long mustaches, while the women wore an astonishing range of elaborate hairstyles and headdresses. While there was as much variety in skin and hair tone as in the human crowds below, most of the gnomes had fair hair and pale skin touched with a golden sheen. It seemed almost like a circus or a dream, with wind chimes drifting through the air and entertainers juggling globes of light. "Oh, well, watch your step," Jode warned. "I know it looks pleasant enough, but trust me, watch what you say." The buildings were as beautiful as the tiny denizens of the district, and most had 2 sets of doors, one size for halflings and gnomes, and one for larger patrons. Jode led Dane past gem cutters and candy spinners, and the smell of warm cinnamon pulled at their nostrils. Eventually, they arrived at a small park, where an elderly gnome dressed in burgundy and gold was tending a bed of fire blossoms. Jode approached the gardener. "I don't mean to tell you your job, but you really should watch out for thorns." The gnome studied Jode carefully, scowling beneath an enormous blonde mustache. Just as Dane was about to step between the two, the gardener grunted. "She's expecting you." Despite his small size, his voice was a resonant baritone. The flowers shivered and dissolved, revealing a staircase dropping down into darkness. Jode smiled. "After you," he said to Dane.